Hi, a very good morning. Right, so very good morning to all. My name is Harvey, and I'm a professor fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities at the Singapore University of Technology and Design. And welcome to our third and penultimate Learning Journey series. I will be your host and moderator today. The Learning Journey is an integral component of the Future Ready Society program, which is jointly led by the LKYCIC at SUTD and the Institute of Policy Studies at Lee Kuan Yew Center for Public Policy, with the generous support from Singapore Tote Board. Our learning journey season runs from September to September and culminates in an October annual conference. This season, our overarching theme is citizen participation and collective intelligence. We are thus particularly pleased to organize today's learning journey on exploring Participedia, a resource for public participation and democratic innovations. As the title suggests, this directly is relevant to both citizen participation as well as collective intelligence. Now, Participedia.net is a global network and crowdsourcing platform for policymakers, civil society organizations, practitioners, and researchers interested in public participation and democratic innovations, providing a crowdsourced database of over 2,000 cases and 360 methods that policymakers and civil society organizations can use to allow citizens to participate in collective decision-making and collaborative governance. We are very delighted that we have the past managing director of Participedia as well as its present managing director as speakers for today's learning journey. Dr. Patrick Scully served as Participedia's managing director from 2011 through to July 2021 and is presently president of Clearview Consulting. He was previously Executive Vice President of the Paul J. Eicher Foundation and Deputy Director of its flagship program, Everyday Democracy. Patrick holds an interdisciplinary PhD in social science from Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Dr. Paul Emilion, I should have asked how to pronounce this, but let me try. Dr. Paul Emilianovic is the present managing director of Participedia and a sessional lecturer in political science in the arts and science faculty. He is an active member of the Schiphol Institute for the Study of Contemporary Africa and the Global Development Section of International Studies Association, as well as board member for Demo.Reset, Deliberation in the Global South and Africa Polls. His research focuses on reconceptualizing development, the state, and democracy by engaging with traditionally excluded ideas and peoples. Let me correct what I said earlier. I think Paul is a faculty member at McMaster College. Is that right? Yes, I think so. So just to correct the information. So before I invite them to speak, I will briefly explain today's proceedings. After Peter and Paul's presentation, the participants will be directed to breakout rooms for small group discussion before returning to the main room for an open dialogue. Please note that proceedings in the main room will be recorded. So without further ado, may I invite Paul and Peter for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Harvey. I'm going to put my slides up. My name is Patrick Scully, as Harvey said, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be with all of you today. This is an exciting group. I have a little bit of a sense from an earlier talk with Justin about the distribution of different types of organizations you all represent, and so this is a very diverse group. We can see that. What I'm going to do is try to take you through a very quick overview of the origins of Participedia, how it came to be, why it came to be, what we tried to accomplish in the first phase of the project, and then we'll have a little transition to Paul's presentation, which will walk you through the exciting work that the project has been doing for the last few years. So we thought it'd be good to have a little bit of sense of the foundation of this project, since it is such an unusual project. So a little bit about me, and it'll help you understand where I'm coming from on this. I came to this work on this project, even though it seems like it's primarily an academic project, I came to it as more of a practitioner than an academic, although research has been a key element of my entire career. So just a little bit about that. So again, what are we? As Harvey said, right here, it's a global network. It's a crowdsourcing platform. It is open source. Anybody can contribute for all kinds of people. It's not just for academics. We find that many of our users are practitioners, educators, policymakers who are looking for, they hear something about public participation or democratic innovations, and this is a good place for them to go to and explore and see what it's all about. How did this project begin? It actually goes back to, because I was just thinking, it's 15 years ago this summer that Mark Warren at the University of British Columbia, who is now the current
Sorry, Patrick,
president.
were you meaning to share slides?
Yeah, slides.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did they not share? I'm sorry. Okay, I thought I pressed share here. Hold on. I did not press my share button. Okay, that was very bad of me.
It's all right.
There
Thank
we
you.
go.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry. I'm a little rusty on this. Okay, so this is just what I was saying. Here's the title of the whole presentation. Here's a brief description of Participedia. And this is where I was just starting. So this project was the brainchild of these two professors. They actually came together in 2009 to start the project. And I'll say a little bit about why they did so in a minute. Mark Warren is at the University of British Columbia. As you'll see here, Arkan Fung is at Harvard at the Ash Center for Governance. They are both primarily political theorists, but they have a deep interest in practice. So that led them to wonder about what they saw happening around them. Here's their hypothesis. I won't read it out loud. I'll let you see it for yourself so you don't have to keep hearing me talk. So they saw something happening, and they think that it is revolutionary, that it may be as revolutionary as the beginning of representative party-based democracy that came out of the universal voting franchise, beginning in the 19th century. Their observation as political scientists who were very interested in this field was that there are many thousands of new channels of citizen involvement in government, but a lot of it's invisible. For example, when I'm at a party and somebody says, "What do you do?" and I work on public participation and democratic innovations, it's not easy to describe it in plain language to a lot of people. It's probably my fault that I'm not that great at it. So what they believe, Warren and Fung, in terms of why this is happening, was that while we get, as I'll say here, there's electoral democracy produces broad mandates for government, but it doesn't generate the kind of fine-grained or legitimacy for fine-grained policy-specific areas. So examples, environmental regulation, urban planning. In this country, education reform is very controversial. So you combine that with people not feeling, yes, we're voting, and we're voting for various representatives and leaders, but it gets down to the nitty-gritty of the fine things that affect us in our everyday life. They don't seem to be really listening to us or understanding what we want and need. The other reason is this happens, this sort of concern that democracy is not producing what it needs to produce is hand in hand with citizens being increasingly vocal and better organized. And they now have an increased capacity to resist and even undermine policies that they see as being simply imposed, even by people who they elected. So the key question for Warren and Fung was, what kinds of participatory democratic innovations are out there? Because there seem to be many more than they could imagine. And which ones work best for specific purposes under specific conditions. Now, as I looked at your first two sessions, I've just seen the headlines of them. So you've heard a little bit about participatory budgeting. You've heard about citizens' assemblies and other types of mini publics, as the term of art is. They are probably the best known ones that are going on around the world. But you could also look at other things, even something as long-standing as protest movements are a form of public participation. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work so well. So Participedia's initial mission was to learn more about these things, these practices, by expanding and strengthening a global network of researchers and practitioners. And that's key. It's not only researchers and practitioners who share deep interest in cataloging and comparing the performance of these different political processes. What do they look like? In what situations do they work well? What kinds of issues do they work best for? What kinds of issues are they not really suited for? And then secondly, to support the mobilization of knowledge to improve the quality of democratic governance. I'd never heard this knowledge mobilization term before, but it's something that came out of one of our funders, and they talk about knowledge mobilization in all directions, both within the academy, for example, and to practitioners. Paul's going to say more in a few minutes about the exciting things that are happening in phase 2 of the project, but I'll just put this up here for a second. Basically, they're building on what we've done. They are enhancing it, they're enriching it, they're taking us in new directions, particularly with a strong focus, even stronger focus on teaching and training, both of students and of public professionals. But I'll let Paul say more about that. First, I thought I'd start with some definitions. So what do we mean by public participation? And what do we mean by democratic innovations? Those are the two buzzwords of the day. Democratic innovations is the one that you'll more often hear these days. It actually, I believe, started with a book that was written by Professor Graham Smith, who was at the time at the University of Southampton in the UK, called Democratic Innovations. So you'll hear these terms used interchangeably. I think that I wouldn't get too hung up on what you call them. As you'll see here, the general idea is pretty much the same. So what happened in phase 1? Well, first I'll back up for a second. I haven't got a slide about this, but how this came to be. So in the summer of 2009, Archon Fung and Mark Warren came up with the idea that the only way you could really capture the information about this, because the field seemed to be so big across such a wide geographic scope, the entire world, in different languages, that they would try a crowdsourcing project. And so in summer of 2009, they worked with a graduate student at Stanford that they knew, and they built a rudimentary site using an old media wiki platform. They then used that as a original proof of concept to try to raise more funds. It took a couple of years. This one I came in to help them do that. Starting in 2010, we raised 2 successive grants from this organization called SHRC. It's a funny acronym, but it stands for the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This was a large grant. It was a $2.5 million Canadian grant. And these grants are based on the assumption you had to have a genuine partnership between a wide range of universities, with Canadian ones being at the core. But over time, leadership of the project was widely dispersed. So in the first phase, there were 23 universities, 4 NGOs, including probably the best known as the World Bank, 30 co-investigators. The difference between a co-investigator and a collaborator, because all of these people had a deep interest in this work. Some more of the collaborators tended to be from NGOs, but it's really only co-investigators that were able to get funds from the granting agency to be able to do things like hire research assistants. So that's why we put that in there as a difference. The main areas of work in the project were, and Paul will talk a lot more about this, teaching, training, and mentoring. So why we put mentoring in there is teaching, well, teaching mostly of students, of course. And that was one of the reasons that the project was started. Both Warren and Fung saw that they had students, particularly at the doctoral level, who were very interested in this field, but they couldn't really find enough data to be able to do a credible PhD dissertation. So one of the reasons was not just understand this field better, but also to help build within the overall social sciences a field of public participation and democratic innovations. And in order to do that, you need to have sufficient data to be able to do so. So that is one of the goals that we'd like to think that we've got a long ways to go, but we are making great progress on it. So in training could be for public officials. There's not been a whole lot of that yet, but we have had quite a few public officials come to us for information about the options that are available to them. The next main area of work was refining data models, and I'll gonna actually walk you through some of the data models in a few minutes, because underlying the collection of all this data, we have to, what kinds of questions do we ask? What distinguishes one type of public participation, one democratic innovation from another? What are the key things you want to look for when you're trying to figure out what each method is best suited for in which contexts? So that was a lot of energy to do that. Talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The other thing was making continual improvements to the user interface. As a crowdsourced project about something that can seem like a fairly dense topic, you have to make the interface as friendly and easy to use as possible. So for example, to the point now, we have been through, I'd say maybe 3 major revisions, both of the data models, not on the same timelines, but of the data models and of the user interface. So for example, one of the big ones, so about 4 years ago, was providing automatic translation of, I think, 6 languages, maybe 7 now, so that anybody can go and they can see all of the data input models in their own native language. And when they enter it in their native language and they save it, it is then translated into the other 6 languages. Quality control. This, as you can imagine, is a big deal. We're all familiar with, most of us, with Wikipedia. And in the early days of Wikipedia, you never really could trust necessarily what was on there. So we had the same issue. Most of the work that we did in quality control was with graduate students who cared about this field, were very interested in it, and they would be hired by some of the co-investigators as a research assistant to work on quality control. So we've also had some full-time staff doing on that for a while as well. And then the other main area of work was getting the word out. One, we needed communications both within the network, because there's a quite diverse and large network, and also to the outside world, to the practitioner world, the world of public officials. Again, this is where this term knowledge mobilization comes from. I'm just throwing that in there because it is a bit of jargon that our funder uses, and I do find it useful. You're trying to mobilize knowledge, not just collect it. So now I was going to do is just walk you through the different types of entries that we have, and then just take a couple of minutes to show you what some of the data forms look like for them. So as you may have already heard, the main type of entry that most people go to look at are cases. These are cases about specific uses of different methods of public participation. And they don't have to be current. They can be historical, they could be ongoing, that sort of thing. Methods. It's interesting, a lot of people think of Participedia as being primarily about cases. I would argue that it's really about the methods, because the cases are a way of better understanding how the methods work and how well they work, what kinds of contexts they can best be used in, for what issues. And then we also have entries about organizations. And these could be everything from the people who are the main organizers and drivers of a project or of an initiative, to people who are basically just not just supporters, but they play a lower profile, but they are part of a project. They're helping to support it in many different ways. So what I'm going to do now, I'm actually going to shift to go to a different screen. Just wait, hold on for me here. Okay. And I'm trying to get down to my, move this. I'm going to go here. And I'm going to go to, rather than show you actually on the site itself, I thought I would show you some of these documents to give you a sense of what the data structure is like for these. It'll give you a sense of the kinds of information we're asking for. There are very detailed data fields that we've tried to make very easy to use. It's in plain language on the site. People can tick off boxes. There's both quantitative data and qualitative data. So I'm just going to use, for an example, the kinds of questions and why they're, I imagine you might have asked yourselves questions about some of these things when you were listening to the other two presentations about participatory budgeting and about citizens' assemblies and that sort of thing. So we do have a narrative text, and this is, I won't go through that, I won't belabor that, but it's fairly straightforward, in which we're asking people to just write up the story of what happened. That, in a sense, it is a case. But then you'll see the kinds of things we ask for. What's the geographic or jurisdictional scope of a case? Is it an organization? Is it a neighborhood? Does it have no geographical limits? For example, there are some global projects that are going on right now using democratic innovations. I'm going to jump down here. For example, purpose and approach. So what is the main thing this case was trying to do? Are they trying to influence or challenge the decisions of government? Are they trying to make influence or challenge decisions of private organizations? Are they trying to do, I know that I think you've done a fair amount of had a fair amount of discussions about co-production, collaboration with organizations and with government. Is that what they're trying to do? And then how do you go about doing it? Are you doing it through advocacy, civil society building, consultation, say through public hearings? There's a wide, you can see here, there's quite a few, there's about 20 options just right there. What about, I think I'll just, well, for example, on participatory budgeting, let's compare this business about participants. Was the process open to all or limited to some? My sense is that when you heard a description of participatory budgeting, you would have learned that it was open to all. Anybody in the community who wanted to be part of it could be part of it. If you compare that to a citizens' assembly, it's actually limited to only some groups or individuals that are usually selected using sortition or random sampling in order to find people who met a certain descriptions, geographic descriptions, so the group would be diverse. So that's an important thing to know. And you can actually, if you're going in, all of these same things, you can actually use our search function to click on any of these things and say, I only am looking for cases that have this and this and this and this characteristic. And you can get very fine-grained with your information. So now I'm going to shift to methods. Again, you'll see a lot of overlap in the data structure for the methods. Again, what type of method is it? What are three types that best describe it? Is it collaborative? Is it focused on community development? Does it feature primarily its deliberative capacities? And you can have multiple choices here. So you can rank them 1 to 3. You'll see a lot of overlap in here with what we had under the cases, which makes sense. There again, there's a narrative text. In terms of participants, was it open to all or limited to some? How did you do recruitment if it was limited to only a few? Was it a random sample? Were they appointed? There are public bodies that are consultative, that are appointed. What kind of facilitation was involved? What kind of interactions between the participants are typically used in using this method? How are decisions made typically using this method? Do you have a survey? Do you have the sort of general agreement or consensus? Do you have voting? Furthermore, if you had voting, what kind of voting? Because there's different kinds of voting. Again, you can see how fine-grained it is. And then last but not least is the organization data. So this just gives us a sense of the universe of the kinds of organizations that are involved in this work. And again, there's a lot of overlap with some of the other questions. But here, for example, is it a for-profit? Is it government, higher education, etc.? So I think what I'd like to talk about a little bit now, I'm going to go back now to my slides. Please excuse my jumping around here. I'm going to have to escape this. Move my screen here and go back to here. And down here. The other thing that I didn't mention earlier is that we also have collections, which are curated groups of entries that share common traits. For example, you'll see here in this little image right here, at the height of COVID, we were approached by Jane Mansbridge, a political theorist, political scientist, and several others to begin documenting what kinds of work was being done with a very quick startup to help the public understand and weigh in on policy decisions that were being made about COVID. So there's some good case, and sometimes it'll be a university, usually University of the Western Cape doing this sort of thing. There's a wide variety. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the transition to Participedia Phase 2 and let Paul talk about the exciting stuff that's happening now. It really, the transition began, I would say, at a meeting. We had 3 large meetings where we would bring together as many of the partners as possible who could come together. We had one in 2016, we had one in 2019, and we had one in 2021. It's just telling me that I'm almost done. In 2019, we had it at the Institute for Development Studies in the UK. And this was important because this organization, this center, does a lot of work in the Global South. They significantly increased our outreach to folks, for example, in organizations in Africa. Although we had some in the project from the beginning, it significantly increased that outreach, and also to South Asia, for example. The next thing was we were able to, and this was hard to do, but we were able to secure a follow-up grant like the first one we had. They're called partnership grants. And we handed off leadership of the project from Mark Warren at the University of British Columbia to Bonnie Abawa, a historian at McMaster University. And it was another $2.5 million, another 5-year grant, and they have taken it in areas that build on strengths that we had and fill in some of the weaknesses that we had. And so under the leadership of Professor Abawa and under Paul, who you'll hear about in a second, I think the project is going in some great new directions. So I'm going to stop there, and I am now going to shift again and show you a video that was prepared for a 2021 Partners Conference that we had, which completed this sort of handoff from Phase 1 to Phase 2. And so you'll see some of the people who are active in the project. And now I've just got to find it here. Okay. Here we go.
I believe that democracy is facing its greatest threat since the end of the Second World War. There are forces that are threatening to erode our democratic principles and values across the world. Xenophobia, inequalities within and between nations, rising forms of populist nationalism, the disruptions of COVID-19 pandemic. Participedia responds to these challenges in democracy by mobilizing knowledge to defend and expand democracy around the world.
Participedia has produced a platform that allows us to very rapidly gather and map emerging democratic innovations. For example, in Cape Town, in South Africa, Black Search works with very marginalized communities to develop the capacity to ask the state why it is not providing basic social services. The sort of north-south binary, I think, is being shifted in Participedia towards a more global perspective and towards a framework of mutual learning.
We're especially interested in Participedia and understanding what kinds of innovations work for what types of issues, when, where, under what conditions, trying to figure out how to translate democratic innovations that work in one context to new contexts.
Participedia offers a large array of experiences and ideas and proposals and experiments covering over 1,800 cases and 330 method entries all around the world on every policy issue and public problem almost that you can imagine. The Participedia platform has generated more than 2,000 active users who are contributing and engaging with content.
Participedia has a very exciting design team, women-led and women-driven.
The designer, developer, we are all women and all inclusive. The data are public, the code is stored publicly. We use a lot of open source technology. It's not just our team that get a chance to making Participedia better. Anyone could.
Participedia is useful for practitioners in terms of accessibility. Participedia really allows for just anybody to look up how to do something in their community.
We've got a really exciting opportunity here to build a very long-lasting community of democracy practitioners and activists and researchers who can sustain democracy in the long term.
The vision is to make Participedia the global classroom for democratic innovation that all sectors of our local and international community can use.
Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Paul.
Thank you so much. Thank you to LKW and IPS, to Justin, Rachel, and to Harvey, and to all our participants in the audience. Thank you all for attending during this morning hour. And thank you to Pat. I mean, Pat, that was an incredibly rich and informative presentation on the trajectory of phase one. And I will say that the weight of the moment doesn't escape me. This is the first time that Pat and I have ever given a joint presentation like this. And it is indeed, you've heard from his bio, an honor. You know, I consider Pat very much kind of a mentor. I've learned a lot from Pat over these years, and we continue to use him as a source of guidance. So even though he's officially retired from the managing director role, he is a kind of forever in the kind of elderly or not, or kind of consultant position, right? This kind of permanent role. So thank you so much, Pat, and everyone else. Let me just share my screen. So I'm not going to be able to talk about everything. There's a lot of work that we are involved in. There's some things that I'm going to not talk about, such as the data model 2.0, which hasn't been uploaded yet. We've been kind of going through some iterations, but it'll be directly related to what I discussed today, which will be largely around the direction Participedia 2.0 has been taking, specifically in terms of our partnership building, our research, and our teaching, training, and mentoring. And then I'll also kind of outline and hopefully jumpstart some path towards participation within the Participedia community for you all attending. I really do hope that you can see yourselves within our community and a role to play. So I really do urge that kind of level of engagement. I will also say that video, despite the lag, if you go to our YouTube channel, there is a high quality version up there, lag free, I promise. It does always give me such a sense of urgency. I get really excited for the task at hand, but also the challenges facing us. And that's really where phase 2 begins. I think when you're going to a funder and you're asking for multiple millions, you need to have a compelling reason why. And for Participedia, that reason is very compelling, right? There's this increase, a mounting of theoretical and empirical critiques of participatory, representative, and deliberative democracy as such, despite this now 30-year plus wave towards the deliberative turn. And so the challenges and threats to democracy are real. I don't have to belabor them. Pat mentioned a few. And governance, quite simply, has not evolved, right? There's policy gridlock. There's an erosion of public trust, dwindling opportunities for genuine participation or direct representation. And there's even questions, about the Eurocentric or Western bias inherent in the liberal democratic project. Who is it really for? And so there's some articles out there, there's some books out there in different think tanks and so on, who actually argue in many ways the field is at an impasse. Some are even proffering alternatives to democracy. Well, Participedia certainly doesn't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. And instead, what we want to do is renew and re-enchant democracy and democratic innovation for a more global audience. So that is really around a renewed sense of partnership building and programming around defending, advancing, and I said re-enchanting democratic innovations globally. And we do this by emphasizing not only the existing asymmetries in our knowledge-making practices, how we study democratic innovations, what we look for, where do we look, but also a greater appreciation of non-Western knowledges, experiences, processes, and tried to create a space of pluriversal knowledge exchange and brokering. And one of the key ways in which we did this, and this was really a big shakeup for Participedia, is we adopted a cluster model, a decentralized cluster model. In phase 1, we're very much centered around participatory governance processes, mostly informal institutional design arrangements, top-down processes. Although there was a wide array of diversity that existed on the website, it was very clear when writing the grant that participatory governance just wasn't capturing the speed or the types of innovations, the diversity of innovations we were seeing around the world. So currently we have 7 new cluster areas, so 8 total. We've expanded to human and political rights, democracy across borders, digital democracy, democratic representation, democratic accountability, and a newly launched indigenous cluster and quantitative cluster, very excitingly. And I'll kind of break this down, what this looks like in a moment. But I just wanted to say a few words about the benefits of this kind of decentralized cluster model. And these clusters, I will add, they're not just left on their own devices, right? We don't just give them money yearly and say, okay, check back in a year. They are indeed supported by core team systems and programming every step of the way. And we really try to bring these clusters together through innovative and inclusive co-design frameworks. And through these kind of co-design frameworks, guided by the cluster model, we are seeing the added benefits of things like the promotion of decentralization and flexibility. When you allow multiple research teams across different geographic regions, different epistemic methods, different thematic areas to operate semi-autonomously, independently, you start to get really amazing collaborations and results. And this flexibility enables the team to focus on the specific passion projects, the specific aspects and contexts and areas of democratic innovation that they are passionate about. So it secures the buy-in while also fitting in within the larger structures and cluster systems and wider team community of Participedia. So it's really important. And we also see that it promotes a kind of enhanced sense of collaboration and also collective intelligence. And I'm glad this term was mentioned in the beginning. It promotes collaboration and knowledge sharing among researchers, practitioners, students, activists, artists, computational experts. I mean, basically whoever's in the room with that diverse expertise and perspectives, everyone holds deep, valuable knowledge, and everyone is a knowledge sharer. And then lastly, and deeply related, and I've used this term a lot, but pluriversality and diversity. And I'll show you what this means on the next slide in terms of the specific research agendas taken up by our clusters. But by incorporating these diverse voices, these diverse knowledges and perspectives from different cultural, geographic, onto-epistemological, and social political contexts, we are really, the cluster model is really thriving and kind of nurturing this sense of pluriversality and diversity, really challenging longstanding liberal presuppositions about what democracy means, what it looks like, and what in turn democratic innovations means and looks like. But what does this very kind of critical, more diverse, pluriversal, expansive orientation towards democracy and democratic innovations mean at the cluster level once you apply these ideas through a co-design process? Well, I thought I would give you the example of our accountability cluster, right? We all know the standard horizontal, vertical accountability, accountability firmly rooted liberal democratic theory. Our accountability cluster comprises 26 individuals, practitioners from Latin America, Africa, Asia, scholars and students from North America, Europe, Africa. So it's a very kind of global, diverse group of interested individuals. And just to boil down their research agenda, which before I get into their 3 specific projects, they kind of captured that diversity and relate it into a singular research agenda. That is to look at how might we explore the various democratic innovations regarding accountability, legal, political, social, and assess their impact upon the latter as well as the other realms. So they have a kind of overarching research question, which then categorizes 3 sub kind of projects. The first, and these are major initiatives, the first one is a project around enhancing public transparency, around viewing the right to know legislation and movements as a form of democratic innovation. So right now, this is taking the form of comparative evaluation of studies on the genesis, design, and implementation of things like the right to information, whistleblower protections, anti-SLAPP legislation. The second project, which is very much firmly rooted in and taken up by the accountability cluster, is around tackling public corruption and strengthening democratic accountability. You know, looking at the politics of state capture, of institutional reform, what are the drivers of systemic public corruption, and what are the role and types of democratic innovations in civic, judicial, and political contexts and among actors in demanding and securing public accountability in these contexts. And they're particularly interested in the cases of India, South Africa, Brazil. They're right now organizing a large international collaborative workshop. There's going to be a book and a few special issues coming out of this. And then the third, so you have very, very much 1 and 2, you can see how this fits in. But the third one, there's a small subsection of our accountability cluster that is working very passionately around decolonizing accountability. Looking at indigenous-led accountability mechanisms and processes from Latin America and North America comparatively, and bringing them together in workshops and through special issues, and then bringing that into our data model upgrades. What type of things do inputters on the Participedia website have to look for? What types of prompts would they be met with? So this is very valuable work, and you can kind of see that diversity within our cluster. And again, I can't understate how big of these projects are. I've dwindled them down to a couple of sentences here, but each one has a series of outputs from workshops, conferences, book projects, special issue collections, and so on. So these are very, very big initiatives, but you can see that quite the diversity. I won't belabor the point too much, but as you can see here, and this comes from a 2023 midterm report to our funding agency, you can see that the clusters are not left to their own devices. We have systems in place to mobilize knowledge around the work that they are doing, to share the stories of their research, of the type of narratives and examples and cases that they're working on and discovering. And so we have things like a student-run podcast team. We have yearly conferences, and we also led a 2-year design workshop, right? So you can see here, we had a discover workshop, then we went through a define, develop, deliver, and we're now in that process of really seeing the fruits of that delivery, the different types of high-level outputs. I'm going to talk about many of them in terms of teaching, training, and mentoring, and also some in terms of research, but we're starting to really see those profitable outputs coming from this kind of decentralized cluster model with a supported kind of co-design and overarching core team systems process. So I'm not going to belabor it, but you kind of see the types of things we've been up to. But before I get into specifically, some of the innovations, teaching, training, mentoring, and also some of the experiments in DI and some of the research, I wanted to talk a little bit about the elephant in the room. We all have a very clear sense of democracy, of democratic innovation, but once we really start to unpack the terms, what do they mean? It starts to get a little messy. And scholarship on DI specifically has remained focused on kind of institutional designs, that favor citizen engagement in policy and political decision making. However, what our community has discovered is that peoples and communities actively innovate in how they address problems, drawing on their distinct worldviews and experiences to creatively and collaboratively respond to the challenges they face and to advance democratic goods as they define and see them in response to their own challenges in their own local contexts and communities. And so what this really, the ways that we want to address some of what I've talked about previously in terms of the challenges of Eurocentric bias, the challenges of buy-in, some of those long-standing challenges to the scholarship on DI, the existing realities that people face around the world. One of the ways in which our community, through their work that we are doing, is re-enchanting democracy and making it more palatable around the world is through things like decolonization. This is a concept that comes up again and again in our meetings at the cluster level, in our team context, in the work that we are doing. A deep reevaluating of Western-centric liberal democratic frameworks, and instead advocating in all of our work, right down to the co-design, for a more inclusive, direct representation and participation of Indigenous, minority group, and non-Eurocentric and global governance kind of participatory practices. And I'm not sure Pat mentioned it, but our design and technology team is actually entirely women LGBTQ plus led. So that's really innovative in this space as well. And the other one I've already mentioned, but around the expanded partnerships, it's happening everywhere in our community. These new and renewed collaborations with organizations, communities of practice, and scholars from the global South. We're not leaving Europe or North America outside of it, but we are actively seeking partnerships and collaborations in the global South, in the majority world, with civil society groups, universities, practitioners, but even movements, labor, student, and otherwise. And again, this is all in an attempt to address that challenge of the bias and buy-in, focusing on overcoming that epistemic inequality in our knowledge production of democracy and democratic innovation, and by also gaining buy-in through creating spaces where really multiple forms of knowledge and different stakeholders can come together, coexist, and kind of inform, as you'll see, innovative projects and collaborations. And so I'm not going to read really the full description here. And this is coming from a book project. Mark Warren is in this, others. There's a really long list of collaborators on this, but we're starting to think about democratic innovations even more expansively. And I just reminder, this is intent over outcome. We're interested in outcome, but we're also really interested in the intent of actors in these participatory processes. And so we're thinking about democratic innovations as encompassing an in becoming not fixed range of intentional, active, empathetic, compassionate, intersectional, inclusive, sometimes combative and disruptive, creative interventions in problem challenge spaces of structural, material, and institutional inequality, sometimes in context of authoritarianism, representative democracies, polarization, violence or its threat, and coloniality, in pursuit of inclusive democratic functions, practices, and norms, not just to deepen citizen participation, which is often can be appropriated and used to status ends, but for genuine self-determination, inclusion, reparations, direct representation, redistribution, like a whole expansive list of norms and functions, which the early kind of definitions, Smith, Escobar, did not quite capture. And this means, and some of this will be updated in our next data model, but what this means in terms of parameters from our community is a greater appreciation of knowledge, location, positionality, but also scale. You know, things like local traditions and roles, the traditional forms of governance structures, the way people deliberate, come together to solve problems, who holds governance power in communities, and so on. The types of knowledges which underpin, the types of principles which guide political participation, community life, legitimacy, and democracy, in formal institutional context, but also in informal arrangements. You know, these are all incredibly important areas of concern for this expanded understanding of democracy and democratic innovations, right? We think about even John Dewey, American political theorist, democracy as a way of life. We have to look at how people live their life, where they live the life, to find out the democratic innovations. We're also paying a greater attention to things like historical context, colonial legacy, past and present. How does it impact the types of political arrangements, systems, practices, the limitations, the challenges? And this also leads into those institutional or community variations. Also at the social and economic factors, right? You can't decouple democratic innovations where we find them, where we study them, from the wider social and economic contexts and practices. And nor can we even confine it, as we'll see, we have indeed a whole cluster centered around it, democracy across borders. You cannot even confine it to national contexts in many cases. And that also leads us to a greater appreciation of scale, of community civil society, not just formal civil society organizations, but the scale of participation across community, you know, social movements, labor movements, student movements, community and informal spaces, on trotros, in informal settlements, in village councils, the types of grassroots activisms that we are just beginning to see and to take stock of, but which have been longstanding and going on for, you know, quite some time. And this leads us, when we take into consideration these perspectives, these parameters, which are being updated into our data model, as well as a whole host of others, we start to see a greater appreciation for the innovative practices and functions around the world at a variety of levels in a variety of contexts, right? Such as village assemblies in India, to deliberative forums in Cape Town, informal settlements, to artistic practices as part of Reclaim the City, and a whole host of many others, a few of which I will mention. In terms of, as Pat mentioned, teaching, training, and mentoring, always incredibly important to Participedia. And Participedia Phase 2, as Bonnie, our director, said in the opening video, really sees itself as the global classroom for democratic innovation. And knowledge synthesis and dissemination, you know, bridging between practitioners and university communities, is really becoming our bread and butter. And we have a whole host of programming around this, from, you know, regularly scheduled teaching cafes in which we bring together, you know, diverse researches in projects or different pedagogical innovations, and then we share that with the wider student, practitioner, and scholarly community. We have a student-run podcast that I mentioned, which brings on different innovative change makers, researchers, practitioners from around the world to hear from them in the podcast. We also have a video series. We have massive online free courses. We have those special collections. We have special issues and book projects, you know, more traditional knowledge mobilization outlets. But really, most excitingly, there's a lot of enthusiasm in our Participedia school offerings. And Pat, you know, mentioned it very briefly. We've had a long-standing tradition in Participedia of the summer school. We recently rebranded this to the Participedia School, just because when you go global, you realize that the summer of June, July for us is not for everyone. So we rebranded to Participedia School. Our most recent was held transnationally in South Africa at the University of Western Cape, and also Memorial University in St. John's in Canada in the East Coast. And that was around transnational democratic innovations. It had over 100 practitioners and students registered for that program. We facilitated by over 50 team leaders, knowledge brokers who came and who built out programming and pedagogy for the school. And so it was incredibly successful. And so I will also share with you now, and we invite you all to register once it becomes publicly available. But there will be 2 offerings next year in 2025 in June and July. There will be a school on digital democratic innovations hosted in Beijing, and there will be one on social movement and indigenous creativity hosted in Rio de Janeiro in June and July 2025 consecutively. Perhaps in 2026, we can have one at IPS or LKY in Singapore. Let's talk about it. But these schools are incredibly important because A, they offer accredited skills training. They support an exchange of learnings between practitioners, students, and scholars from around the world. I mean, this is truly global. That leads to skill and field development, long-standing collaborations and partnerships, which ends in kind of that accredited certification. So it matters, the work matters, but also, and this is incredibly unique, it speaks to Participedia's capacity as a bridge program, as the school on democratic innovations. We really pride ourselves in the interdisciplinary, intersectional, and international exchange. You're not going to get it elsewhere. We provide that opportunity for practitioners, students, and scholars to engage with their experiences and peoples and ideas from around the world in collaborative, co-designed problem-solving frameworks that lead to new research questions, policy approaches, often leads to working prototypes that can be built out and applied. And as I said before, long-standing partnerships. The partnerships forged in these spaces, not only do they become involved in our community, become Participedians, but they continue to work and do this great collaboration afterwards. And I also mentioned we often try to get really a consortium of the leading scholars, practitioners, theorists, the cutting edge, those doing this cutting edge work to inform the learning of the school, the pedagogy of the school. And we often kind of package it all in co-design problem-solving frameworks. So this is incredibly innovative expansion of our summer school offering, newly branded Participedia School. Please look out into the promotional material coming out late fall, early winter around our June and July 2025 offerings. And then interestingly, I talked a little bit about cluster level research, the model of decentralization, the diversity there, gave an example. I spoke a little bit about teaching, training, and mentoring, some of the innovations there. But what we're also seeing, and this is coming out from the cluster level and also our core team, is that Participedia is experimenting in democratic innovations and partnering in these experimentations through a series of pilot projects with organizations around the world. So these are things like, and this is not all of them, this is just a few, but things like using deliberative civic technology like POL-IS to have environmental discussions around best use practices and environmental resource management. Also, we played a pivotal role in the Demo Reset project, which is now in its second iteration. And that was primarily around 2 phases. The first was the design jam in Bogota, Colombia, which brought together over 70 practitioners from the Global South, Latin America, Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, for a week-long design jam session to prototype solutions to shared problems. And then in the second phase, this then led to a learner exchange program in which the prototypes were sent to different universities and organizations and kind of built out and developed. This is now in its second iteration. The partnerships are expanding as well as their learner exchange programs. We're also involved, incredibly important, the governance vocabulary initiative. Participedia is not, you might know this, is not the only one. There's the Latino Project, the Civic Tech Field Guide, and a few others. And we are partnering with I4 Policy, the School of Collective Intelligence in Morocco, and a few other organizations to create a public front-facing platform which will be connected through Participedia to house and to connect and to create a shared space, which allows for cross database searches and cross database use of AI bots and so on. And so this will is being built out in our own phase 2 data model upgrade, but it's also going to be launched through this public facing initiative, which will be all connected to our website and more to follow in the near future. But we also have wonderful experimenting going on in dispute resolution deliberative processes in communities aggrieved by development around the world. We have clusters engaged in that. We have some clusters and different research teams engaged in arts-based methods, giving tools to community partners in informal settlements to document the way they hold the state accountable and hold community leaders accountable for things like sanitation provisions. And by technologies, I'm meaning, a camera to use this artistic medium to document those type of innovations, experience, and so on, and then bring that to power and to use it to gain concessions and so on. We also have a new grant for activism or for artivism and to host a hackathon in which we seek to bring together artists, computational practitioners, regular scholars on democracy, on democratic innovations. Oftentimes you don't get these three groups in the room together, as well as practitioners, through a hackathon to prototype some tech-based and art-based solutions. In addition to consultations and other experimentations. There's a lot going on there, and I don't want to say it all. And I also appeared that I'm running out of time. So this leads us then into Participedia's future. And Participedia's future is really working towards long-term, sustainable, unrestricted funding. And we really want to achieve this by continuing to strengthen and expand through partnership building and the types of research projects and knowledge mobilization projects that we're doing our existing substantive areas, those cluster domains that I mentioned. And each one has their own research questions, their own research projects and different outputs. So we want to build from our cluster level expertise to develop and expand our memberships, to build out new fundable cluster-led projects supported by our core team systems, our programming, our co-design frameworks. We want to intensify this work. We also want to continue working with practitioners to strengthen and expand frontline democracy, right? We want to continue to position Participedia as it has been from the very beginning as the learning network of researchers and practitioners that develops and promotes evidence-based research to inform practice and teaching of democratic innovations, right? And this builds off our recent successes to facilitate mutual learning between researchers, students, and practitioners, namely in our Participedia school, but also our other programmings, and providing leadership in research and teaching while simultaneously developing our capacity to work in partnership with practitioners and communities around the world to address specific needs within our substantive areas. This work needs to be done. We need to greater appeal and integrate the experience of practitioners and communities. And then lastly, we have to continue the mission, continue to amplify communications and spread the work of Participedia to support democracy, right? To make more people aware of Participedia, our resources, our outputs, that we're not just a database, that we're a community with very innovative programming. And we want to continue to communicate and leverage the current and real concern about democracy, and to clarify for people that there is a way out, that democracy is not just voting, and that DI, democratic innovations, is not just participatory budgeting, and it's not just something that happens in between elections. It's a way of life. People creatively respond to the challenges that they face all the time. And we have to find a better vocabulary and the tools, and Participedia is trying to, with our latest data model update and what we've been doing from the very beginning, is trying to capture these innovations on the ground in all their speed and all their diversity, right? Because they're happening every day. And also, there's a huge global array of participatory and democratic methods that really can give people a more meaningful, powerful role in governance. And we want people to be aware of them. So really what we are interested in for the foreseeable future, in addition to the specific domains, is continuing to think democracy more globally, more expansively, to think it differently. And we want to continue to address those asymmetries in how we collect, analyze, and mobilize knowledge about democratic innovations in the global south, but around the world, genuinely. And we want to do this through participation, community co-design, continuous cycles of input, feedback, building on iterations, prototyping, experimenting what works, what doesn't, taking risks, and also community involvement, outreach. You know, we're a community in flux. We're expanding every day. We have this designation between informal and formal partnerships, you know, but this is very loose. We're expanding all the time. We're finding innovative ways to get partners funding, regardless of status. And also, we're going to continue to build out these partnerships, continue to do our research and innovative teaching, and find ways to become sustainable long-term, to expand our mission and to become sustainable. But how can you participate in Participedia? I think many of you are probably already thinking about this, but you can engage with Participedia quite simply by writing cases, you know, organization or method entries. If you want to have special collections, reach out. We can talk about it and get one set up for you. And these have been cited in policy publications, in peer-reviewed publications, in books, and elsewhere in organizational reports, government reports, you know, really around the world. And so these aren't done in vain. They're incredibly useful, but also for early career researchers, for practitioners who want to log and reflect on their own experiences. It's quite generative. It's quite a generative outlet. You could also use the data, right? Incorporate the data maybe into classroom settings. Have students write cases, go out into the community and write on a democratic innovation. You can collaborate with our community members to assist in our co-produced research projects, in our knowledge mobilization outputs, our teaching cafes. You can join one of our podcast episodes, attend one of our schools. You can join a cluster. You know, if you're interested, if any of the cluster topics appeal to you, please reach out and I can set you up to join a cluster. You can also join and register to our public events and our newsletter, our teaching cafes, our cluster-led workshops, our different experiments and conferences. We have a bi-monthly newsletter. Please sign up to it. We just had our most recent one came out, I think, last week. You can also identify cases for knowledge mobilization. Is there an exciting democratic innovation or case that is going on? Or maybe it's a project that you're involved in or initiative that you're involved in, and you want to amplify it. You want to spread awareness to a global audience and have our kind of community weigh in on it. We can be that outlet, you know, reach out. And then lastly, I just really urge you to participate in the broader network, to find an entry point based on your own passions and interests. And because really the possibilities are open. The possibilities for collaboration are open. And it's only once you really get involved where we can see where that leads to. So I think I talked a lot. I'm not going to talk anymore. Thank you so much. But before we get into our breakouts, I would like just to say a few words about the format of our discussion, and then I can hand it back to our moderator, Harvey. So what we'll be asking is really to practice some of what we do at Participedia in terms of bringing diverse groups together. You all have your own experiences, valuable knowledges and insights and perspectives, and we want to hear from you. We want to learn from you, hear your thoughts in small breakout groups, but then in sharebacks. And so we'll ask in small breakouts that you discuss at least one of the three following questions, and then that you designate one group member to do a shareback discussion highlight. I think there is a facilitation team leader in each of the breakouts, so you might not have to make that decision, but this is what we are asking. And Harvey, I'll pass it back off to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Patrick. So we will proceed to the breakout rooms now.
it's, one thing I think that would take away from that is that my guess is in most political systems, government is going to be averse to trying something that's new and untested that they don't have a lot of control over. So when you talk about the shiny new thing, something like, for example, the sortition, I mean, they can sort of see that and you can draw some lines around it. In other words, that we're bringing a select group of randomly selected people together, and they will deliberate about they'll learn, they'll deliberate, and they'll provide some feedback perhaps to the government. You can kind of control that a little bit more. So I would think that's an example. I don't want to just shine a light on that, but it's an easy one to identify. That the governments are going to be more risk averse, for example, than a sort of organic small d democratic movement or project that comes up. So they tend to kind of do the same thing. The thing, I think it was you, Lewis, who talked about the shiny new object. And yeah, there's a lot of that. But sometimes that can be a foothold. It can be a way to get the way in the door for them to try something like that they've never tried before.
Yeah, I thought maybe I could jump in here. And I suppose if we look at it from, democracy from a political ideology point of view, yeah, you could get that, a response from the government. And definitely we are not looking at, the democracy like what we are getting in the US presidential elections discussions coming up. But I think, in terms of local issues and engaging the community, the public, there are many opportunities. I work on a project on activating underutilized spaces, to build social engagement and, health promotion, and we have been engaging the community. And I see Steve here, we work on a panel together with social workers, and we are seeing how to reactivate them, to do more. I think there's a lot of opportunities. I found the presentation very good. Thanks very much for the sharing on Participedia. Lots of information down there, but I thought a key point was what Harvey brought, which is contextualizing it. And, I'm just wondering, how do we find what is relevant? What should we look at? I searched for Singapore, and there's only one example from Singapore. Yeah. And we know the issues are so broad, so diverse, and there are so many tools available. And so where do we get started? That's one point. The same point I thought which was very good was what, Harvey mentioned about the democracy and, the knowledge capacity. And, to actively participate, you need to be able to come forward, the right mix and have that, in a way, the intellectual discussion. And in a way that discounts a lot of the community, practical issues they are concerned about. So how do we be inclusive, and not in a way be that academic elitists, that, okay, yeah, the intellectual capacity come in and debate and put across your point. So, you're part of the democratic process. Otherwise, too bad, you can't speak your mind and so on. Yeah. So I think, how do we really leverage this very good information and resource that we have down here and contextualize it, for various settings? Yeah.
Maybe to jump on Eugene's comment and question is that if I look to the Participedia, there's lots of cases and approaches, and it's almost overwhelming. And so how do we start, in the sense that if I were interested to create a new citizen engagement project, is it going to the database and searching for, a feature like voting, or because I want everyone to vote or make decisions? Is that how I find cases that I can use? Or is browsing better? Or I just wondered how we would navigate the database based on our circumstances.
I guess yes, it can be overwhelming. I think that's a challenge that it sounds like, Paul, I've been kind of out of the loop a little bit for a while. In terms of, because I learned a lot from Paul's presentation. I'm super impressed. I knew they were doing a lot, but I didn't know about half of that stuff that was going on, frankly. But how do you periodically draw sort of best case lessons from all the data that's out there? We've tried some work like that when we have commissioned articles from another, from a researcher or so, and they'll say, talk about this particular problem and pull together what you've learned by looking at the information that's on the site. So we've had a few articles like that, but they're not academic articles. They are more just to sort of tease people with the idea that this is possible. So I guess my answer is, one is we could do a better job of periodically having those kinds of what are the lessons documents. Secondly, what I would say is, that said, where I guess I would start, if I'm understanding your question correctly, Justin, is I would use some of those fields that you can select on. So think like, is it a particular issue? Look at that issue. Is it a particular, click on that, then go, at what level of governance? Is this metropolitan? Is it national, et cetera? Click on that, and go through some of those things and just see what pops up. And it would really filter it down so that in many instances, you will only end up with a dozen or so articles or 20 articles. And that becomes more, that's one of the things I think is, if we'd had more time and you could really walk people through it, and it's a little bit of a challenge to do that in a live stream when you're walking people through the site and saying you could do this and this and this and this. But there is a bit on the site. If you go to, I think on the research section on the site, where there's a little tutorial on how to do searches and how to use the faceted search function. So that's what I would recommend.
Thanks for that.
And just to expand on that, we do have an exciting development which is in the workflow of Pan, our league programmer, but it won't be implemented for at least another year and a half. Maybe, yeah, I wouldn't say longer than a year and a half, but we're going to have an AI chatbot, and this is also coinciding with the Global Vocabularies Initiative. But we'll have a chat assistant bot, so you can type in a question like, how much does it cost to set up a citizens assembly in whatever type of context? It'll give you some answers, right? Right now, it's just keyword searches kind of on the database, but we're hoping that the utilization of AI and some other tech on the website, some new upgrades, the new data model 2.0 and so on, that we'll be able to better address some of these questions and features, right? Make it more usable and interactive in that way.
It'd be really nice to hear the rest in the room.
And also, can you, before you speak, if you just say like what your role is, like what you do, the context you're coming from, I would love to hear it.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for that amazing presentation, the work that you do. I'm Steve Lowe from the Lian Center for Social Innovation in Singapore at the Singapore Management University. One of the things we do look out for is issues of inequality, looking out for the sideline, the marginalized, so on and so forth. I'd love to hear, and I probably don't have time, I'd love to hear some examples of how Participedia has been able to hear the voices of the sideline, the lower socioeconomic status individuals. What has been done to involve these ones into the conversation? And are there examples that we can show and stories we can tell of success stories, if you like?
Pat, do you want to say something about Coady Institute? Then I can say about a more recent example, because Coady Institute, long-time relationship with the practitioner base, I think really.
Yes, and there is a Coady, I think there was a Coady collection there. So two things came to mind. Well, one, there's a specific case that was actually mentioned in that video. Bettina von Lieres is a Canadian scholar.
Black Sash.
Pardon?
The Black Sash, yeah.
The Black Sash, yeah, Black Sash, which really, it's working with people who are experiencing the challenges in their daily lives and bringing them in to do active research. It's sort of action research on the ground. And then the other example that Paul talked about is, I believe there was a collection from the Coady Institute, which focuses a lot on community development work in the global South. And they actually have done some papers about, there's a couple of articles, I think, that we have in our Medium. We have a Medium section on, we have a section on the Medium site. So there's some articles in there that do some of this sort of bringing together of a sample of examples around a particular issue or situation. I forgot what the question was. It's how do you involve the people who are, everyday people on the ground who are experiencing these things. So I think there have been looking for those times where we can find some collaborators who are doing that kind of work, who are also interested in sort of action research and working with us to help document it. So yes, we have some instances like that I think, and Coady Institute is a great place for looking for that. And IDS action that I mentioned before, the Institute for Development Study, the University of Sussex, we have a collection with them that was specifically around local economic issues and economic empowerment. There's a lot of working with local activists, everyday people on the ground.
Yeah, I was going to say the same. There's a lot of co-written narratives, and even in the new data model that's being implemented, one of the major changes is we're creating a space for kind of autoethnography, which is a fancy way of saying personal narrative or experience to allow practitioners to kind of use I statements and to more easily convey their experience and knowledge of the case that they're writing on or the method that they're writing on. In addition to some of the community work, I will just say that if we take our most recent Participedia school, for example, we were able to fund in total, we ended up giving significant scholarships in excess of this, but we funded in total costs over 40 people. So it was like 43 people. That's airfare, hotel costs, food. And these were primarily individuals, practitioners, some students from across the global South, the global majority world, community change makers, leaders working in organizations who don't have the resources or can tap into the funding to attend kind of international events like this, to be in spaces with a leading consortium of global experts, practitioners, and knowledge brokers from around the world. So we really pride ourselves on providing a space to create a space to have these kind of innovative, transformative exchanges. And we're going to publish a report in the next month. There's going to be a nice video that's coming out of our work from the school to capture some of these narratives and transformations and so on. But it's about the co-writing, working with community and practitioners to co-write content for the website, but then also through our programming to build genuine spaces and to support people fiscally, financially, materially, because sometimes that's what most matters, to attend and to be involved in our community, right? To create space and to address the structural, material, and epistemic inequalities, right? And how we think about, talk about, and exchange knowledge about democracy and democratic innovation. So it's really important for us, and it's going to be on the agenda moving forward. And it's just going to continually to deepen that work and to be a better space for practitioners and community leaders. And our Indigenous cluster is another major development. Indigenous peoples now finding a space in Participedia, seeing Participedia as worthy enough for their stories, for their knowledge, and so on. And if you know a little bit about Indigenous politics in North America and Latin America, it's quite the honor, but it's also a big responsibility. So a lot of work ahead.
Great. Okay. I think in the interest of time, maybe we join the main group again for a broader dialogue and Q&A.
Everyone is back in the main room, so I think you can begin.
Okay. So so they are all here already.
Yep.
All right. So what I'll do is maybe I'll just ask the representative of the breakout rooms to give a quick minute or two summary of what you've discussed, including questions that you may have. And for the rest of us, if at any one point you feel that you want to comment on whatever that's being said, please feel free to do so. So maybe I ask Suhaila first. Suhaila, what transpired in your group?
Right. Okay. So for the first question, about the citing of like participatory democracy in their professional setting. So many have said that they're already in this space, or they actually experiences a lot of this in the workplace itself, and they already have a voice to decide certain things, while others don't really have the opportunities to voice, and this is a concern. What was shared also that there is this hope in terms of the hopes and dreams. There is this shared desire to learn from the on-the-ground practices and insights. But there is also this observation that everyone is working in silos. So maybe this person has this idea, but this person has this idea, but there is this gap in like sharing of information. So one organization might not know what the other one is doing. So hoping in the future there might be a consolidation of ideas. And in the Singaporean context, there is also this concern of voicing out or the subtle fear due to legislation like the Protection from Online Falsehood and Manipulation Act, as well as Defamation Act, which can actually stifle open dialogue. So in these kind of structures, how can we then change people's mindset towards like critical thinking and using one's voice for good? And that's a question that mostly in the breakout group that we had. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I think before I invite the second one, this contextualization is something that I think Participedia has done a lot. And I think in my own group, we've shared as well that, you know, it's democracy as an idea is ideal and it's evolving, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily evolve in the right direction, or at least in the minds of either the people or the governance. So there needs to be a real honest discussion with the right knowledge, I suppose, you know, open knowledge to get there, to have us arrive at the same spot, so to speak. Maybe let's see, Aishwarya, sorry.
Hi.
Yes.
Sorry, what was the question?
Oh no. Can you sum up what transpired in your group?
Okay, I was in the same group as Suhaila, so
Oh, you were in the same group. Sorry.
I think you mean
I'm so
Aisha.
sorry. Aisha then. Sorry, Aisha.
Yeah, so I was in room 3, and we had Jasmine and Chen Hong. So Jasmine's a researcher and Chen Hong's an urban planner. So it was really interesting to hear their insights. The first question, I think they both agreed that there was some sort of democracy in their professional lives, and they see it up and coming, especially Chen Hong. She was sharing that she does strategic planning for a city in the Middle East, and they actually have initiatives where they talk to people who live in the area from different socioeconomic statuses, and sort of getting a consensus, a common goal before they start the strategic planning for that city. So that was quite interesting. And then we sort of like veered off into talking about how much participation is okay. So as Singaporeans, I think we have this consensus that how do you balance, right, participation vis-a-vis making sure that everyone gets heard. So there's this concern that you may ask citizens for their opinions, but how much of it can you actually deliver? And we don't want to get to a point where we ask so much and we don't deliver, and the citizens become jaded, and then you know, have this paradox. What else? In Singapore as well, like because of the nature, we use like our HDB blocks or our apartment blocks as a proxy for socioeconomic status. One of the participants is a researcher, so she actually finds that a lot of people from higher SES, they're even more difficult to reach than those who are perhaps like from lower SES. And another interesting point, the last point I will land on, is our context as an aging population. So that was highlighted a lot, emphasized a lot. How do we reach our elderly who may not be able to, even if they wanted to participate in certain democratic innovations. How do we explain that to them, and how do we bring them to places that we want to have discussions with people of different ethnicities, ages, and so on? Yeah.
Right. So it's broadly a question of having a, pardon the word, democratic reach to enough people that is representative of the issue that you're dealing with for this instance. So I think that's part problem of context, but it may be overcome by the right processes, perhaps. So maybe later on we can have a discussion on that. For the last group, Danawa.
Hello, yeah, so I was in group 4 and I'll just provide a brief summary of what we discussed. Yeah, so there was a lot of discussion about specifically within the context of Singapore. So I think a lot of us find that we do have a strong government that has done relatively well on behalf of the citizens. And as such, like we as citizens have benefited from it. But then that means that there isn't a nationwide culture of participatory governance. And there's actually a lot of heavy reliance on the government to initiate and actually solve the problems for us. And I think some of the experiences that tend to bleed this kind of culture into like people's workplaces, I think one of the participants did share that there's actually a fear of groupthink hindering democratic participation. And so there's this fear of having a different voice from senior management, who are usually in the realm of who are usually the ones making the decisions in the workplace. And so that kind of hinders people from giving their true opinions on what they think is important to the topic that is in discussion. But then, you know, as a conversation moved along, you know, everyone realized that there is some improvement over the years. Like there has been more communication channels between the citizens and the government. So apart from Meet the People session, there's also the nationwide forward SG conversations that have been held by the government. And specifically in like certain workplaces, I think one of the participants, Mei-Ling, she shared about how she works in the healthcare space. So they do solicit feedback from dementia patients and caretakers. And these feedback actually were used to create programs catered for dementia patients. So kind of using insights from the patients themselves to improve the efficacy of like their programs. Yeah, so I guess now like it's more about moving the needle forward, right? Apart from just citizens providing feedback to sit and then moving it to a space whereby citizens are taking the initiative to start these ground out initiatives and stuff like that. So I guess Participedia can be like a great resource for us to like gain inspiration and adapt it to the local context. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I was briefly making some notes. I can only capture one broad idea that runs through every breakout group, which is that although there is some affirmation of the ideals of democracy and democratic governance, but there are real concerns as to whether the highest potential of democracy and such governance can be achieved. And the fears, well, the fears are mainly in two categories. One is the fear of not reaching out to a representative number of people or set of people. That's one. And the second is in the event that we do reach out to the requisite people, perhaps what they suggest may be not quite, you know, objectively good as a collective. So that has to do with where they come up with these ideas, you know, or whether it is an idea that is a mob mentality kind of idea. So maybe I can invite the speakers to address this, or if anyone else in the main group wants to address this or other issues, feel free to do so.
For either Paul or I see Thomas has something to say.
Yeah, thanks. May I just share my small perspective, right? Thank you to you, Patrick and Paul, for sharing your perspective about democracy in the context. But my question is that thinking democracy, at what stage do you start to teach thinking democracy? Do you just start with when they are young as a student, or when old like me, senior, about the best, I outline about the aspire? You know very well that in our school there's not much thinking can be done. A lot of things you are not allowed to think because we are not taught the thinking skill in a more critical manner, right? And my second perspective is that thinking democracy also happen in the workplace. Do you know that in Singapore context, when you employ a person, you have to pay him or her 4 to 5K? And I know of a company, private SME, who employ the person and bully him or her, by making him or her do all the rubbish work here and there, so much so that she had to resign. So can we move thinking, about democracy or whatever you have in mind, more to workplace so that people can have more better lifestyle? Oh, that's my comment. Thank you.
It's a tough one.
I can lend some. I remember talking to Trevor Schultz, who he invented the term platform cooperatives, and I think he mentioned something like we make a big deal out of political democracy, but that's 1 vote in 4 years. But workplace democracy, right? Worker-led firms, cooperatives are way more meaningful to achieve because that's 80% of your energy and investment. So you can democratize the workplace. That's way more meaningful than political democracy. But I noticed also that in Participedia, there is a lot of stuff like that now. There's community wealth building, there's co-ops, community currencies. So that's really interesting as an expansion of what counts as democratization. Maybe just to reflect, or maybe to add a question is, I think in our own government's mind of the evolution of collaborative governance, we've gone from more, we are the clever guys in the room, we'll communicate to you what the policies are, towards more consultation, and then towards more co-creation. And I wonder, is there a next phase of it? Is Paul and Patrick, you're very careful about, it's a Western model, right? The liberals would love it that we are moving towards more and more democracy, but is it a linear thing that more is better than less? Is co-creation always better than, let's say, consultation? And it seems we need to think a bit better about it, because if you had asked me, if I put it on a spectrum, maybe beyond co-creation is all this permissionless participation, right? Whereas a lot of citizen participation requests, requires the government or nonprofits or large stakeholders inviting people to come and be part of the decision-making process. And perhaps then the aspiration beyond that is permissionless participation. I'm thinking even in our Singapore government's partnerships office, there is, in Scotland, there's a participation request function. A concerned citizen wanting to improve a service can write in, and an agency has to respond. And in a sense, we are slowly building towards that as well. There is an ability to write in to the partnerships office and say, we want to do something here, and they will point you in the right direction. And of course, permissionless requests like Participedia itself is permissionless, right? Anybody can go online and do that. And then the challenge there, I kind of feel, is how do you coherently accumulate a knowledge base that is useful for everybody and still, allow this kind of permissionless. And it feels like there's a bit of central administration and coordination. You have your kind of intelligent cluster systems with people working, but still inviting a lot of people. But even then, you go there and you see like lots of cases with just one sentence, right? And then, but I guess that's the nature of it. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on, do you take a position that there is better, that democracy is evolving and the more people can make decisions, the better it is? Or is it more like a pluriversal thing whereby we gotta figure out, maybe not, I'm not sure. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I'll take a crack at that. I think that not everybody wants to be, your average person doesn't want to be spending too much of their time figuring these things out. So, and I think depending on your circumstances, everything from your financial circumstances to where you live to your personality type, you're going to want to be involved in different things. On a slightly different but related track, sometimes when I used to do, I did a fair amount of consulting, going out in communities where people said, oh, we want to bring the community together. So it would either be a completely informal group, like a neighborhood group that wasn't incorporated at all, or it would be an NGO, or sometimes it would be a local public official. It really depended on the context. So you have to think about what you want of the other people you want to bring in. So if you're a public official and you're saying, I want you to, I'd like you to invite you in to be part of this consultation, what are you really promising? What are you saying that you're going to do? And I think that my experience has been, and this is, I can't point to a study that says this necessarily, but is that people want to be treated like adults when a public official asks them. It's not like they're a child and the public official is the adult. And so say what you really want. If you want us just to tell us what we think, what are you promising to do? So for example, in my experience, a lot of people who've been through a process, even if the public officials then disagree with the decision that the people have made, the promise that the public official makes, if I disagree, I'm not going to necessarily do what you recommend, but I will give you full, honest, and detailed responses to why I don't agree with you, so that it seems a little bit like you're getting a deeper, more nuanced explanation of the policy choices that the public official is making than you might get in a campaign, for example. And it's the same thing from I used to talk about this as who's asking who to dance here. If the citizens are asking the public official, what do they want of the public official and what are they willing to do? And if I was, for example, an NGO that worked in the community and the public official is going to say, well, how do I know that these people that you brought together are representative? Well, not everybody has the finances, for example, to do a random selection process. And on the other hand, another downside, for example, of doing only a random selection process is that you limit the number of people that it's possible to reach, because you've got a small sample by definition, and there's this whole community that might want to be involved. So it's a very tricky it's a matrix. You've got lots of different variables that you've got to mix in. I have been working on a piece trying to for public officials to say, here's like a half a dozen things that you want to think about before you do this. So it's tricky. There's not an answer, but I do think that being honest about your expectations and your promise of what you're going to do or what you're not going to do on either side is really important. And one other quick thing I'll say is there were a couple of questions about how do we know that we're really reaching the people, a diverse enough cross-section of the community. How do we know that we're reaching the people that need to be there? And that's a lot of hard work. It goes to, I don't know how much community organizing you have in Singapore. It's not everywhere here in the States either, but there's a lot of lessons to be going there. You really go out and you know who the usual suspects are, and I mean that in a good way, who are going to show up and volunteer. But how do you find those people who are busy because there are two parents and they're both working and they've got jobs at odd times? And how do you structure things so that you can get those people to feel, do you provide childcare for them if they want to come to the community event to be part of this? There's all kinds of things that you can do to make those groups more representative and more inclusive. But there's not an easy formula for it. There's a lot of work to be done.
I was going to wrap up, but I think this was a very good wrap up that addresses one of the key concerns that, at least in the Singapore context, we often face, which is to first rally the people to be part of the process, and then to worry about what kinds of people, how many people, how far do we probe their views, and when do we stop at this engagement process. I think his answer, if I may sum up, is I guess we have to learn it, do it by practice, and gain enough experience and for the people involved in this entire process to be genuinely concerned that to make this process work. So organizing this, you have to be sure that this is what you want and you want to make it the best version possible. I think it's not easy to follow advice, but I think it's real concrete advice that we need to take it. So with that, I thank Patrick and I thank Paul for their time. I know it's very late over there in North America. So please thank our speakers today with me. And before we conclude, Rachel will share the fourth and last of the learning journeys with everyone. Just a minute more.
All right. Thank you to all participants in today's learning journey. Our final learning journey 4 will be covering the topic of designing systems that harness collective intelligence, scheduled for the 10th of September from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. via Zoom in Singapore time. So please block out your calendars for this discussion with Robert Laubacher, who will be presenting the work of the Collective Intelligence Design Lab at MIT, including their Supermind Design Primer, exploring how collective intelligence can be leveraged to address social challenges. The invites will be sent out soon, so do look out for it, and we hope to see you at future events hosted by the Future Ready Society team. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Abby. Thanks, Paul and Patrick.
Thanks,
Great group. Thank you.
Thank
Great
you,
question.
everyone.
Yeah, great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good discussion.
Bye-bye.